feel free to enter them. Thank you, Jim. Feel free to enter them into the Q&A section and not the chat section. We have panelists that are standing by. That's Jim and Jeff. If it's a question that's going to require any research, then we'll have to get back with you as soon as possible. So we'll get your email address if we need it. The chat is also available for tonight. Please keep it nice and respectful to each other's responses. We'll monitor it, and if anyone's not following proper etiquette, we'll have to remove them from the webinar. Please do not use the chat for questions to the panelists. That way we can keep track of them in the Q&A and make sure that we do answer those questions. We hope you have a wonderful time tonight, and thank you for joining us tonight. Mark, the floor or the webinar is all yours. Thank you.
Great. Yep. Welcome, everybody. It's a fun topic. I didn't realize how much time I would need to spend on this. It was very interesting doing the research to dive in. And I do have a personal strike experience to share further down in the slide deck. So again, please be sure to ask questions as we get going. There's a ton of data here, more than I could possibly squeeze into an hour. So feel free again to ask questions afterwards. So let's get going here. So the usual thing, success is more volunteer pilots and more GA pilots flying more and flying more safely. We're working on building out a safety resource center at Air Care Alliance, and if you would like to help with that, let us know. These webinars are about sharing experiences and content. I'm not an instructor, I'm a commercial pilot, a very active volunteer pilot. And I did well learning from mentors along the way, and just trying to do the same, pay it forward now. Deer and wildlife strike accident review is and prevention in particular is a personally interesting topic to me. We had a very expensive airplane get totaled, which I'll share with you in a bit, due to an unfortunate encounter with a deer. So we'll review some crashes and incidents, some takeaways, and we'll look similar to the winter ops experience. We'll go through looking at how the NOTAMs get created and the variation in the NOTAM content, and then some of the decision making around how to use that data. Probably no surprise, 97% of all the strikes are birds on approach and landing, and mostly in the day. About a quarter of the incidents with birds occur at night. 2% are mammals, but obviously those can be much more destructive. The mammals are much larger usually. And a kind of interesting statistic, 1% are raptors. I can't think of running over a snake. Our happy place, again, we're working on making that safer. Again, whether we're carrying blood, people, animals, it's a very addictive thing to be doing. And again, we'd like to all do it in a more safe manner. So we need your help to spread the word. And please let us know if you want us to do any presentations to pilot groups or associations out there. So interesting map. I used AI actually to help generate this. This identifies the high risk, moderate risk, low risk areas to have some kind of wildlife encounter. And this is also showing you the migration routes. I got this from the FAA data. So if you overlay this with the most common routes for getting access to medical care, for example, this is an example of where the major cancer treatment facilities are. You're pretty much going to encounter some kind of wildlife or have the opportunity to encounter some kind of wildlife. So there's not many swaths of the US where you can avoid some kind of animal encounter. And the human factors that come into play that I can see most commonly from the literature I was reviewing are perhaps overconfidence or complacency about the threat. Not so much a feeling of invulnerability as just thinking that it's not going to happen to me. It's too rare, and I want to get my mission done. So I'm not going to be that one person that has that encounter that's going to keep me from my mission. And if you get into risk mitigation, you just need to know where to ask and who to ask, and understand how to read your data sources. There's really not been much formal scenario training that I ever ran into during my training experiences. And not that I hear about there, we probably want to request more scenario-based training around this topic. Um, Interesting thing about the migration routes, the FAA and the Department of Agriculture do track the migration routes, and these are the four main routes. Atlantic, which is pretty descriptive, Mississippi Flyway, which is also pretty descriptive. Central is west of the Mississippi and east of the Rockies, and then the Pacific Flyway. Um, those are pretty major routes, and if you want some staggering numbers, it's estimated between 500 million to a billion birds fly through those routes every year. So it's the chance of you encountering a bird during your flying career is probably greater than you think. So strikes went up a lot in 2024, about 14%. This year, or for 2025, the data is not out yet. It may be flat or a little less from what I'm reading, but it's still fairly significant. As I mentioned, training and experience varies across all the hazard data creators as well as the users, us. And it's no different than the winter ops variability that we were discussing in the last couple of months. Um, there are more formal risk mitigation programs now, a lot more formal than when we had the event in the Hudson 10 years ago or so. But is it enough? It's probably never enough, but at least there are programs going, and airport managers and personnel are getting better training and have better processes. Data collection and reporting's got better, but again, I'm not sure us as pilots get much training on how to use it. And then there is a lot of variability about where the data goes, whether it's a NOTAM, something that I learned about letter to airmen, which we'll go over in a bit, chart remarks or supplements. So again, opportunity for inconsistent data exists just like in the winter ops. So risk mitigation, this is why we want to work on this as a topic and be sensitive to it. So there's been a few strikes, as you can see, and the cost is not trivial. And it's been a fairly heavy loss of life as well. So with birds in particular, it's most typical below 3,000, but they can occur at 8,000 all the way up to 37,000 feet. So kind of an impressive range. There's an FAA website dedicated to the wildlife issues. That's wildlife.faa.gov. Here's the QR codes for those. We do have the same PDF file that we're trying to publish every time. I think Jim is going to try to put it in the chat. If not, just email me afterwards and I'll send you the PDF with all the websites. The FAA does want us to report strikes. AOPA provided some data in one of their publications saying that they think 80% of the strikes are not reported. So if that was the case, then this number would be even much more impressive. So again, lots of data to look at on your own if you're curious. This is a good website to go to. It also gives can point you towards what the airport operators get as a operating manual. Our host who just got introduced, thank you for giving us support and are now into year 2 of doing these. Um, the Wings program, again, good program. I'm working on my advanced right now. Again, any excuse to train for me is good, and this is giving me a good discipline to follow. Rob Newman, you met. Lex Crossett's been trying to get in. He'll be hopefully a panelist going forward if he doesn't get in. And we had 2 airport managers in the winter ops reviews. They both had conflicts, but they did provide me with feedback, which was very helpful, which we'll share in a bit. So always I like to share data on why we're doing all this stuff as volunteers and giving us an excuse to fly to places we otherwise wouldn't be flying. And right now there's 360 rural hospitals that are in jeopardy of closing. And that means that people in those areas will be even more in need of volunteers and others to get them to medical care. And green in this map are people considered to be living in rural areas. So you can see it's major sections of the US are considered rural. And my usual hodgepodge of other numbers for reasons to be a volunteer. volunteer pilot organizations. I'll blow through this. These are the same organizations month to month, but again, we need your help. There's always some a good reason to fly. Education, medical care, disaster. So one of the projects we're working on, and again, if anyone has any interest in helping us out, is coming up with a card that will go on your lanyard that will be uh, calling out safety issues or checklist issues that you may be able to use on a regular basis. This is an example from United Airlines that all their pilots wear, and they review every flight, um, including what they did well, what they could do better, and the reasons for that. And then calling out different organizations in the US, Angel Flight Central, great organization if you live in the center part of the US. GA pilots are needed, and they're going to Texas and Minnesota and other places on a regular basis. STEM flights.
You can change kids in your community, right where you live, anywhere in the United States. We help you find the kids, you fly them, and you inspire the next generation to pursue aviation and aerospace careers.
That's Carly, who's usually doing Q&A, but it's on vacation this month. But it's a great organization if you guys have. Typically, it's a one and done that you end up forming a relationship with the students you fly. And the EA Aero Educate is another great source of information for kids interested in STEM. Tom Haynes, who you may know from AOPA days, is working on a nonprofit now, Elephant Rhinos and People. They're looking to set up an ability for pilots to go to Africa and help do audits flying carbon cubs. So if you're interested in this organization, again, the information will be in the PDF that you can get from us, or you can do a quick scan here. So I wasn't going to do any follow-up on winter, but I ran across some unusual information on my last trip to northern Maine, where I seem to always run into winter or odd things. So prior day, everything was looking good at the airport. Still winter conditions. Called the FBO, the usual no answer, but it was a launch, beautiful day. Air traffic control had no updates. Had en route icing, but nothing reported at the airport. And I landed, and there was puddles and sand and ice on our water on top of ice. So, what could I have done better? Just call the FBO until they answer the phone and get updates on both wildlife and conditions. We're getting into the month where migrations can start, and I had gotten out of the habit of thinking about possibilities of wildlife already. So they had an interesting NOTAM that I'd never seen before, which was braking was 555, but it was 100% wet and sanded at 50 feet. And this is their widest runway. And then they had their perpendicular runway reporting 555, 100% wet without sand, but then that the taxiways were sanded at 25 feet. So I just didn't know what that meant. I'd never seen that kind of NOTAM before. So I got there, and again, it was wet. There was blotches of sand, no consistent sanding, and it was on top of patches of ice. So when you go to rural airports, you're not always going to get feedback that you know what to do with. So if I'd seen this before I went, I may have been more persistent at trying to get someone to describe what's going on, but it wasn't a normal snowstorm, so I was perhaps too complacent. It wasn't super slippery, but again, one of those things is running across. I've been flying there for 15 years and I've never seen anything quite like this. So another one into northern Maine, passengers late, leaving late. Been there many times. New airplane, excited to use it. This is me again. Everything was favorable, and it was using a perpendicular runway, which isn't typical for that airport. Approaching from the southwest, and was an unusual, almost snow-like white patch along the edge of the runway, but didn't pay much attention to it. Just thought that maybe there was leftover snow for some reason. Um, but when I got closer, I noticed the white patch had motion in it, which was a little disconcerting because it looked to be like thousands of birds, more birds than I'd ever seen in one location. Um, so I did continue to land and land successfully. Um, but again, in many years of going there, had just never seen anything like that. Um, and they took off, fortunately, in a direction away from my direction of landing. So I was not too concerned, though I was concerned about whether I was making a good decision about stragglers. So I could have gone north and circled around and given the birds a chance to fully leave, just to make sure. But it worked out. It made me think about in the future what I want to do. So this is the example of the runway. They were near the arriving end of this runway 28, and it looked pretty much like this picture. And these were substantial birds. So um, since then, I've learned that this is on their migration path, and I must have just been lucky in the past not to see them on the ground, though I'd seen large flocks in the air. So understanding the migration times of the year, um, and coming up with a way to approach that what seemed got to be important to me. So from the FAA content, got migration is April through August. March through April, which is now, and August through November. So that's why on my most recent trip, I needed to start thinking again about migrating birds. And again, reinforcing that most of the strikes occur below 3,000 feet. But for the bigger birds like ducks and geese, they can be up to 7,000 feet. So how do you mitigate that on your approach? Do you fly low, or do you try to stay high and get a good view and then come back around? Some more examples of the migrating routes on the left, bottom left of this. So this is from AOPA Safety Institute. They have a somewhat older article on bird hazards, and some of the recommendations and observations are not really in a lot of content. And again, I did not get a lot of training on this. Hey, Rob, did you ever get training on this kind of content?
No, we didn't. We did a lot of low altitude flying in the Air Force, but it was, don't hit a bird was there was not a lot of choices where you were going to fly, and you was just a see and avoid thing.
Okay, and I was curious whether the military really focused on this at all. Um, again, birds have a tendency to dive. I've got this coaching early from one of my mentor pilots because we were in an area where there were a lot of wildlife, which I'll share in a little bit. Um, and Turning lights on, I was never sure that turning the lights on would make a difference, but was advised to do that as well. But one of the ones I learned by doing this research is that birds on the ground have a tendency to face into the wind. And that if you're taking off, their backs will be to you. And as they take off, they may take off right over the runway because they're not looking in your direction. So that comes back to, do you clear the runway first, especially if you're at a rural airport without a tower, or do you just wait for them all and make sure there's no stragglers? I've taken off assuming there was no stragglers and not hit the stragglers, but felt like I was coming too close to the stragglers to be comfortable. So I'm a bigger fan, and I'll show you why, of doing a clearing the runway exercise. So this is also from the AOPA Safety Institute content, and this is where I got the 500 to a billion birds that are migrating over the U.S. every year. But the reports have been that they've spotted the geese above 20,000, and they've had bird strikes as high as 37,000 feet. So it gets more rare as you go high, but you're not safe. You got to be really attentive during migration. I'm not sure how many of you have seen these huge hundreds and hundreds of birds in the flying V formations. So another fun one, and Rob, have you run into this where you've had turkey encounters?
We have turkeys. We do have turkeys in the local airports outside of Philly. It's not uncommon to see them.
Yeah, this picture here is Marshfield, Massachusetts. You can see the habitat is conducive to wildlife on the right side of the airport. Um, the turkeys there believe that cars, people, and airplanes are not of consequence, that they're going to stand their ground and they'll even chase you. So they're pretty impressive, and they get in the news all the time during the year for being aggressive. Um, so it's something you don't mess with. Same thing with seagulls. They seem to not care. Um, but if you hit a seagull, you're gonna know it. They can be pretty big, 30 inches by 60-inch wingspan, and weigh more than 4 pounds, but 2 to 4 pounds easily. Um, this is a good example of an encounter on the left, and they'll stare you down. And all I can say, I've run over one that just refused to get on the runway as I was landing short final. I just assumed they would get out of the way, and that was the only seagull of the group that didn't leave. Um, so yeah, not a fun day, but luckily no damage on that day for me. Um, it can take multiple runs to get these things off the runway, and I can't stress enough that it's important not to get caught making an assumption that any of these birds are going to get out of your way. So one of the things that we talked about briefly during the last couple of months is how can I use AI to give me some data if I want to just ask a simple question? And this is me typing into Copilot, which is a Microsoft product. What are the wildlife hazards in Maine or specific airports? And these are what they came back with. Um, the primary hazards and the time of years and why. Um, so, and a lot of the airports are unfenced. So yeah, there should be no surprise that deer and coyotes can get on them. So don't be afraid to use the new tools that are out there. They can give you some quick answers, but just be sure to double check it if it doesn't seem to make any sense to you. It's not ready for prime time. So here's the Department of Agriculture is working with the FAA to publish data on this. And if you're sort of nerdy like me and like to get into the numbers, it gives you an idea of what the different strikes are. And again, if the AOPA data is correct and 80% aren't reported, then these numbers are way off, but or way under, or way too small, but still impressive numbers. So about 22,000, um, and probably in the 700 to 800 airport range, depending on which data source you're using. But very impressive numbers, and again, can do significant damage just because of energy. So
Mike, we have a question that I think would be general interest here. Do flocks of migrating birds fly in clouds? And can ATC see these as primary radar returns?
not all the time. So I've only
There's
been warned.
two questions. Which is not all the time?
Oh, do they fly in the clouds? Yes. Do they fly? Can ATC see them as returns? I've only had them maybe called out twice.
Okay.
Um, so in the Miracle on the Hudson, that was a fairly large flock. And I don't remember those pilots getting any warnings, right, in advance of that. And so I doubt that they had a primary return. Uh, but I did a couple of times that I did get callouts. There was hundreds and hundreds of these geese and flying in V's, on a route adjacent to me, but not in my direct path. So it must have been enough. But I'll add that to my research. So if that person wants to send us an email, I'll be glad to respond to it.
Okay, thanks.
So So just like I have a winter process, I have a wildlife risk process. Um, and it's based on the time of the year and the time of the day that I'm going to be flying, and is it a typical time for migration. Um, so my diligence or my checking will go up based on the responses. I'll then start. I now know enough to look in many different places, unfortunately, but usually I'm only going to 2 to 4 airports in a day, so it doesn't require me to dig too deep into the data. Um, NOTAMs I'll go over in a second. PIREPs are helpful, but it's you find very few PIREPs on birds encounters, and I wish there were more. The FBOs as well. Some have good, are sensitive to it, but could be better. I do find pilot friends that fly similar routes to be good sources. And in some cases, the airports, again, you wouldn't know which airports to call because they have good data. But if you're a repeat customer, you'll figure that out. And then I usually do a couple of days beforehand, check everything again. Um, ForeFlight has some comment areas, so does AOPA's uh, airport section and other forums. Like with any flight, have a good, reasonable divert plan. And again, if it's migration season, ask a few more questions, be a bit more diligent. And one day before, get really diligent about digging into the NOTAMs, seeing if there's been any accidents or incidents. And sometimes the FBOs would know of those, and again, any PIREPs. En route, if it's migration and I'm looking out the window and I'm seeing birds, I'm going to ask ATC if there's anything that they've heard of. And generally, the answer has been no, but I don't mind asking the question over and over again. If it's a CTAF, I'll ask on frequency if there's any activity. I've only ever gotten one response to that. And airport ops, it's usually hard to get information. But I'll try to, when I'm approaching, I'll try to understand where the threats can come from, which direction, what side of the airport. Try to make my approaches be as stabilized and slow as possible. I'll use lights early. If I'm flying the plane that has radar, I'll actually turn on the radar. No one's convinced me that that makes the birds move, but I was told once that it might. So, anything in my favor, I'll do. And then I'll be ready to make a decision about whether it's going to be a low approach or a divert because of wildlife in the area, um, and not be shy about doing it. So if we have time at the end, I have 5 more scenarios that we can go through that you might find interesting. So anticipating wildlife where the strikes can occur. This is a landing going into Norwood. Um, And this is an area where we see a lot of birds. This whole area can be flooded. So whenever I'm going into a new airport, I'll try to get a satellite image and try to look and say, where can wildlife be? And ForeFlight and other tools allow you to do that pretty easily. This gives you an idea. This is an airport that's been around for decades and decades, and you can't see the fence because it's like a 4-foot fence. So it's not keeping land animals out, and it's certainly not encumbering any birds. So here's a scenario at that same airport, July mid-afternoon. Passengers are late going to Maine again. They're happy because they're going home after a successful treatment. There's no co-pilots. Nice clear day. The pilot, not me, is not night current. But even with dropping off the passengers, he'll be doing that during daylight, and will be arriving night or late dusk in the modified plan. So he has some familiarity with the home base. He'd only been based there a year. And on the return, there was no NOTAMs about wildlife or anything else. There was just a standard weather ATIS. He was cleared to land. There was no talk from the tower about any wildlife in the area. And during the flare, multiple deer ran across the runway. So he could, because it's late dusk, and as you can see in this bottom left picture, when the darker it gets, the easier it is for these animals in particular to sort of blend. When you're briefing for the wildlife factors, what's the location on the airport? What type of risk mitigation does the airport provide, if any? And where are you going to be looking as you're doing your approach? So in this case, he hit one of the deer, maintained good he enough thought to shut down the airplane correctly and manage the incident on the runway. There was not a lot of clarity on what you do after an event like this. And that had not occurred in my training either. I just had an accident on the runway. What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to report it to? So he touched down about 85 knots. He didn't see the deer darting. It was a 100-pound doe and shut off the nose wheel. So this is a picture of the plane stopping without a nose wheel. Fortunately, nothing else happened. But deer went into, that's what's left of the nose wheel afterwards. And both engines ingested deer parts. So they had problems during shutoff. And you can see the nose cone was impacted as well. So the force was enough that this part of the fuselage, which was one piece, had ripple crumples in it and it caused the plane to be totaled. So this is a side note. Make sure your plane is insured for its current market value because it gets really hard to replace it unless you're getting. So we were probably 10% underinsured for this event. So here's a picture of that end of the airport and where the tower is. And so typically if you were to see deer or coyotes or any of that, it would be along this corridor. And this is their normal habitat. It was a pretty large habitat. And where the deer ran from was this side of the airport. The tower was here, building in the way, and not a typical place for the deer to be hanging out. So no warning from the tower. And you typically didn't see that many deer, especially since they probably came out at dusk and not a lot of us were flying at dusk. And then the later dusk landing probably didn't help this pilot because he just wasn't familiar with the airport and wasn't used to knowing where the risk could come from. So again, nothing was noted for pilots where the hotspots could be. And what's happened since then? The ATIS warning, the ATIS now includes a warning permanently that there's wildlife on the field. So they're being overly cautious, but almost to the point of if you hear it all the time, how do you know when there's really a threat? It's really coming back to the pilot having to figure this out and learn where to look on the airport. On the same thing, NOTAMs, there's a year-round NOTAM, but it's not specific about where to look. And we'll look at that a little bit more in detail. The tower is now more attentive about calling out animals. But again, how good is the tower going to be if it's a small animal and it's dusk? It's going to be very hard to see. And they're putting in new fencing. So the old fencing was half of this height, and this is deer mitigation fencing. So there's a major investment for airports to put in fencing that will actually slow a deer down. So you're going to see that most airports will never get much more than 4 feet or 6 feet. Just the cost is significant. So this is where this particular deer strike occurred. and again, not in an easily seen area. So deer strikes again were a small amount of the overall, but there's still enough to cause major damage. And the problems are predictable. It's usually 2 hours around sunrise and 2 hours around sunset, just because that's when the deer uh, can be camouflaged. So as a pilot, we need to know when to look out for deer, and that's an easy way. So here's our airport manager feedback. Should be adding comments in the chart supplement, and we all just would need to get into the habit of looking in that data source. But the problem is that everybody's listing it. And I showed you that example before where it was listed at the same time as, there being a golf course nearby. So it can get buried in the remarks, and you can almost just skim over it and think that, wow, okay, this is not going to bother my flight. I won't be one of those guys. Um, so their opinion is that really it's got to be on the pilot to know the fences aren't going to keep out birds, and there's a lot of the cases the animals are just going to jump over. And then it's super large, not super large, but larger airports, they're not scanning for animals and there's no automation to find the animals. So it's not going to be easily monitored. And typically then there's not going to be a NOTAM in advance that there's deer hanging out at a particular section or birds in a particular section. They feel that most of the NOTAMs that do come out about wildlife are a reaction. They're not helping you avoid the event. So one of the things that we did run into recently, or I ran into recently at one of the flights, was this is a no cannon, a noise cannon. It's run on propane, and they set it off to scare the birds. So risk mitigation is important at a lot of airports, and they're doing something about it. But again, the more rural you get, which is a lot of us do as volunteers, you're probably not going to see these. So here's the NOTAM at Norwood Airport that is now somewhat permanently posted for birds and deer. And you can see on the bottom left that in the remarks, it's a very generic call out. You don't know what time of year is really the hazard or where to look. And it's really on us as pilots to understand where we're flying in. So this is the habitat around the airport. So there's a lot of things that can live there. And the airport's just inconvenience to most of them because the fencing has been inconsistent. And a lot of airports, you'll find that, especially if you're flying into rural areas, upstate New York, Maine, the western part of the U.S. Getting a report on the type of fencing is not going to happen. One of the other things that we've learned in all of this is the reporting, the NOTAMs are inconsistent, even though airports are within like 20 miles or 30 miles of each other, where you would think the activity of wildlife is consistent. So these are 3 airports within a 10-minute flight of each other, and you'll see one airport that has no mention of wildlife. You'll see Norwood, which has got a sort of a permanent one for deer and bird activity. And then you'll see Plymouth, which is even bigger than Norwood, have nothing again. But then you'll get to New Bedford, which is about a 15-minute flight away from Norwood. And there's no standard wildlife warning, which you'd think should be there, but there is something called a letter to airmen. And I'm not sure how many of you have run across these, but this is the first time I had run across one of these. And it's mentioning bird hazards at Providence, which is to the west of New Bedford. So again, something I really hadn't understood before. And Dan and Keith, our airport manager references, said they had not seen letters to airmen used to warn pilots about the proximity of wildlife and what would happen in terms of reporting if they were to encounter wildlife at an airport. So here's what the letter to airmen looks like for that particular airport. Um, and it says that they're going to put the bird hazard advisory on ATIS if it's there, but it's not going to be on ATIS unless it is there. And they'll report it on all frequencies every 15 minutes, again, if it's happening, and that's down here. And then they may write a NOTAM if it's deemed necessary. So us as pilots, why aren't we getting the same level of information about when reporting of a hazard is going to happen at all the airports in the vicinity? It's very interesting. And finding where it is in ForeFlight or Garmin or on the open data sources is not straightforward. So anyways, be diligent, look. You can find letter to airmen in ForeFlight if there are any at an airport. The FAA NOTAM search tool provides them as well. Any questions, Rob? Are we doing well?
Yeah, we're doing fine. There have been a few questions and we've covered them, and you've gotten to them eventually.
Cool, thanks. So interesting accident. Not sure you guys heard about this one. It's fairly recent. Fairly new plane in Michigan, taking off from a grass strip at 10 o'clock at night. Pilot's reasonably current. There is a remark section for the airport again about there being animals on or in the vicinity of the airport, but no accidents have been reported at that airport. There's no NOTAMs. There's nothing else calling out wildlife as an issue. You can see from the satellite image here, a lot of places around this long grass strip for wildlife to be hanging out. There's no report of there being any fences at all. And again, this is at 10 o'clock at night. So it's going to be dark and there's no runway lighting, obviously. So paraphrasing, if you listen to the audio on this, you'll find it interesting. The reports to ATC that having some control issues, and I'd like to find a service center to land at. So I guess that's a logical response, but if I'm having airplane control issues, I'd rather get on the ground as rapidly as I can. And TSB report more or less summarizes that the pilot ends up making a no flap landing, and that there is substantial damage. And he does divert to Grand Rapids, which is a much better airport, but he's flying for a long time, an hour and 40 minutes. So clearly trying to diagnose the problem, tried to make a couple of approaches before finally getting on the ground. Had entertained pulling the chute. But again, this airport had no fences and just all kinds of good places for wildlife to be hanging out. And this is what the rear elevator looked like. Wasn't in very good shape. Surprised that they didn't have more control issues. And if you look at flight path and altitude control, had some interesting moments of control. Did go around trying to get in, and on the the third attempt did manage to land, but pilot remained calm and did a good job. I'm surprised he didn't pull the chute, but it all worked out. But again, this is one where it's never happened before at the airport. I'm not going to be the first. And no mitigation, no risk mitigation effort. Did not clear the runway, taxi up and down, make sure everything's clear first. And may never have been coached to do that. May have flown out of this airport many times and no one prior to him had a problem. So why would he? So the things that we need to do are not get caught in that trap. I because of the turkeys that I've encountered for over the years, I don't get caught in that trap. I do a lot of back taxiing, so, which when flying the jet is not a cheap thing to be doing, but when I'm flying the Cirrus, it's a lot more tolerable. Um, and again, if I look at where the risk points are in this area of Michigan, you can get a lot of data. Uh, and this data came out of using AI again, and it right away said limited fencing. So as soon as I saw that, you should be expecting that there's a good opportunity, especially at night, for some kind of animal to be in your way. Now, again, this is where an example of something getting lost in the airport remarks. Attended, but deer and birds on and in vicinity of the airport. When? Where in the airport? None of that's called out. And then they have another remark. So if you're reading this quickly in microprint on your iPad or somewhere else, this is going to get lost. And is this data even usable? Um, so and this one still is kind of a confusing one to me. 100 low light available self-service at the golf tees. Have you seen that before, Rob?
No, but I don't land at grass strips at night.
So yeah, we're blowing through things tonight. So if there's no data sources, I think I went over this. Um, we'll dive into. I'm going to skip ahead and I'll come back to that. So I'm not sure how many people are on the West Coast or have flown in Colorado, but I was recently at Pueblo, Colorado. Very impressive airport. And you can see the terrain and environment around the airport's very, very rural, gets even more rural than this picture shows. And it has a very interesting NOTAM. So it's down here. This is what the NOTAM looks like. And this is using the FAA site again and converting it to plain language. It just says mule deer wildlife hazard. Where on the runway, what time of the year, all that stuff. We're supposed to figure that out on our own. And when I flew in, it was during a training exercise. I flew there twice in 2 days. I never made it this far down. I just saw wildlife hazard mule deer and skipped over it. But you can see that in this environment, a deer is going to blend in at dusk very easily. And if they're migrating, that's a very big animal to get in your way. So if the tower's closed, are you going to do a lower approach, make sure there's nothing on the runway, and then come around? Or are you going to trust the tower to make sure they're seeing that animals, on the runway or near the runway and a risk? A lot of ifs there. So just if you're flying to new places, the diligence to go in and really spend a lot of time looking at the risk is something important to do. So we can come back to this is another good example here. Fairly rural airport, but fairly busy airport. Pilot that has reasonable time. An airport apparently was common knowledge to have deer on the ground, but not necessarily anybody pushing that information as common knowledge or checking that new pilots to that airport knew about it. So again, if you see an environment, getting a PIREP or going after feedback from someone who's based there, or at least an FBO, is very good to do. Oops, this is wrong. This should be 75. So in this particular one, 3 deer ran across the runway during landing roll, and 1 deer went over the wing. It turns out the airport fencing was basically non-existent, and that was not noted anywhere. And there had been prior deer incursions and prior strikes, and that was not on a NOTAM anywhere. So again, things that we don't have a data source for, so how do we find that information out, especially if we're going to someplace rural, and especially if it's during a time of day where that particular animal might be active. So I'm going to go back to here, unless there's any questions. And we
Mark,
have,
Mark, one of the questions was coming into an airport with known animal life. What is the best procedure? Overfly the runway and at what altitude?
this is just me giving an experience feedback, and this is not me, being trying to be an instructor. Um, anytime I do a low approach, I won't go below 200. I'm not sure if anybody else has that as a rule, but that's just what my mentors sort of beat into me. Um, and I'll usually try to stay higher than that. Um, and again, I'm trying to fly as slow as I can to make sure I have a good enough chance to see what's going on. And I'm not afraid to do offsets. So nothing says I'm flying exactly down the runway. I'm not sure that's an approved technique, but I want to make sure I can have a good view of the runway environment. And I'm not, especially in rural places of the Northeast, I'm not afraid to do more than one of those, especially if it's at dusk, just to make sure I'm getting a good assessment of what's going on. Um, and fortunately, that technique has worked for me for the 15 years I've been flying into these remote places. So hopefully that answers the question. But yeah, I would not be afraid of going to 200 or 300 above. But that's just me. You'd have to find your own personal minimums for doing that. And I would go practice. I mean, all of this stuff, if you have a mentor you can go practice with, that's a good thing. And you can see in my little multi-step approach to dealing with wildlife, in the back of my head is a low approach, something I should do. And if I see thousands of birds at an airport like I did at Prescott that one time, I'm probably not going to hope they all flew away in the right direction. I'm probably going to divert and not get surprised by a straggler. So this very first one, it probably ties into that question. Millinocket, Maine, um, is fairly far north, very rural, no tower, a pilot shack, phone that doesn't really get answered, runways that if you land, you end up landing multiple times because the frost heaves are so significant that it throws your plane back into the air as you're landing. Grass is growing, it's lightly used. And in the fall, and there's no lights, and it's in the fall and it's dusk, you're you're challenged to wonder what animals you're missing when you're landing. So I've now made the decision in the last year that I just don't go there. If it's getting near dark, um, the decision is to find a place that's nearby, which unfortunately, if you're carrying patients going home, then maybe that someone has to drive an hour out of their way to go get them. But I'm not risking it anymore. It's not worth it. Um, so yeah, know your airports as well as you can. Get PIREPs, do whatever you can to get reference information. And there's no reason to put your plane through getting launched off of frost heaves. Um, Next one's Hyannis, Massachusetts, Cape Cod, gazillions of seagulls, lots of seagulls. And clear day, no notice for wildlife, no warnings about the seagulls. Um, I think the air traffic control and the tower and ground controllers just expect that you know about this because they just seem to be everywhere. Um, and there's on this particular case, turboprop, short final, some seagull activity, but there's birds on the runway. And for the most part, experience says that they'll get out of the way. And this particular day, one decided not to get out of the way. So we continued and unfortunately ran over that particular bird. But mate, as we were pulling off, we asked if the tower if he saw the bird, and he said, "What bird?" You know, so we reported the bird as FAAD on the runway. So another lesson learned: don't rely on the tower controllers seeing that you ran over something, and leave something sitting on the runway that could hurt the next guy. So easy lesson learned. Um, Next one's going back to my home base airport, summer day, many, many, many sparrows and lots of hawks in the vicinity of the airport. Um, no ATIS or NOTAM at the time about extra bird activity or where they would be. Um, Threshold, there was flocks of these small birds, and they were missing the plane. Um, but I landed, and when I landed, the lineman said, "What's that spot on the side of your engine?" And it was about the size of two hands, and it was a big bloody splotch. Um, and somehow, whatever bird that was hit us, or we hit it with enough velocity that it must have vaporized, you know, but luckily did not go in the engine as far as we could tell. Um, and this is an example of one of those cases that we didn't report it because we didn't know that there was even a reporting system for bird strikes at the time, and there was no harm to the airplane. Um, and we didn't report it to the tower because we
So
obviously didn't know.
if you're going into an untowered field and you have a bird strike, what's the process for reporting that? Who do you tell?
You tell the FAA, if you go back to that wildlife.faa.gov site that I mentioned in the beginning, there's a place where you can fill out a form to report your strike. And they very much want us to be reporting strikes. There's a great effort that they're going through in terms of risk mitigation, and we need to give them the data.
Okay, thanks.
The next one is another example. There's a tower, multiple FBOs. Um, there's no wildlife ATIS, nothing seen, but get there and there's a huge blood stain and some globs of something on the nose wheel. So the question is, you know, can you rely on a fairly major airport seeing all the types of wildlife that can be on the runways as you're landing? And the answer is no. So you can try to be more diligent based on what you're seeing at an airport or where you're going. Um, but you just need to know that you may not ever see everything. Um, but if you hear thuds or have interesting handling, you shouldn't just assume you shouldn't ignore it. You should make sure you check it out. So getting back to the bird strikes, so that about 25% of them are at night. I mentioned I was doing this webinar to a JetBlue pilot on Saturday at an event, and he said, "Oh, glad you mentioned this. I was flying an A320 Logan at night over Boston Harbor, so it's pitch black when you're out over the harbor." And he and his co-pilot hit an extremely loud bang, but it's just one big bang, and it's right in front of them. Um, and they're not seeing anything. There's nothing else abnormal, so they continue the approach. They land, they get there, and it's a um, large seagull that had hit the co-pilot side window at approach speed. So the birds are flying at night. If it's in a very black area, you can easily encounter still a bird. So you still need to be sensitive to where these hazards can be. And then the bottom one's in Michigan. This is another one of me landing. And again, late fall, no ATIS, no NOTAM, dusk. Um, and short final and noticed a lot of deer. And it's at an airport that I'd only been to once before. So the question was divert, go missed, continue landing. And I continued to land. I didn't understand the threat because I just said, "Oh, I see, 3 deer, and they're probably not in an area that they can catch up to me." But I didn't say, "Well, if there's 3, are there 10 more somewhere?" So those are questions that we need to be more proactively asking. And I should have gone around on this one. That's what I would do now. Um, so again, just sharing experiences. I don't know where we get this in training, but we do need these kind of forums to just share experiences, and you can make up your own mind about what your personal minimums are. So I think we've run out of time. Do we have any final questions?
I think everything's been pretty well covered in the questions in the chat. So thank you.
Great. I mean, I really encourage everyone to go off and do more research if you're curious about this topic. Wildlife hazards are significant, and we have many more things to hit these days. And I think you'll learn a lot if you spend time, especially on the wildlife sections of the FAA information. So thanks again, everyone. See you next month, I hope. And that should do it.